The night they came for Sean Cole, the man the world knew as Big Daddy, no one watching the news felt surprised. And that was the most terrifying part of all. Here was a man who'd built an empire, a billionaire who'd shaped the sound of a generation. The founder of Empire Sound Records, the label that had launched 1,000 careers. And when federal agents stormed his mansions in Los Angeles, Miami, and New York, dragging him out in handcuffs on charges of sex trafficking and racketeering, the world didn't gasp in shock. The world nodded and said, "We knew." Because the signs had always been there, hadn't they? Whispered in green rooms and recording studios. Passed around in hushed conversations at industry parties. The teenage artists who came to work with him, boys like Trevor Mason and Marcus Raymond, and left with something broken behind their eyes. The mysterious deaths of his biggest stars, Deshaun Big Truth Williams and Andre Ace Martinez, both gone before they turned 30. The legendary parties at his Malibu estate, where the music never stopped, and neither did the rumors. But Big Daddy had always been untouchable. Too rich, too connected, too powerful. He wore the mask of a philanthropist, cutting checks to inner-city schools and youth programs. He gave speeches about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, about grinding until you made it. "I'm a lion," he'd said once, leaning back in a leather chair during an interview with Malcolm Davies, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Whatever I want, I take. Whatever I need, I get. That's how you survive in this world." The interviewer had laughed. The audience had applauded. No one realized they were hearing a confession. It wasn't until Jasmine Cruz filed her lawsuit, detailing years of abuse, control, and terror, that the first crack appeared in Big Daddy's armor. Then came the others. Backup singers, producers, assistants, people who've been silenced by fear and NDAs for decades. And when federal prosecutors laid out the evidence, calling Empire Sound Records a front for a criminal enterprise, the mask finally shattered. My friend said, "I can't hit 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove them wrong." Subscribe to Mr. Sammy's Stories for entertaining, story-packed videos. The hotel surveillance footage, the testimonies, the patterns of coercion spanning 30 years. It was all there, documented and undeniable. But the arrest didn't bring closure. It brought questions, darker and more disturbing than anyone had imagined. How had he done it for so long? How many victims were still too afraid to come forward? And perhaps most chilling, who had helped him? In an industry built on connections, how many of Big Daddy's celebrity friends, his powerful allies, his trusted business partners, had known what was happening behind closed doors? How many had participated? How many had simply looked away? The scope of Sean Cole's alleged crimes suggested something beyond one man's depravity. It pointed to a network, a web of complicity woven through the highest levels of power, which left only one question that truly mattered. How does a monster like this get made? To understand that, you have to go back. Back before the empire, before the fame, before the billions. Back to a freezing night in January 1975, when everything that would follow was set into motion. Raymond Cole sat alone in his car on Riverside Drive, the engine running against the brutal New York winter. Today, Riverside Drive is all luxury apartments and pristine views of the Hudson River. Joggers run past brownstones worth millions. Families stroll through pocket parks. It's one of the most desirable addresses in Manhattan. But in 1975, New York was dying. The economy had collapsed. The city was hemorrhaging jobs. Unemployment had reached levels not seen since the Great Depression. Businesses boarded up their windows and fled to the suburbs or to other states entirely. Entire neighborhoods looked like war zones, buildings burned out and abandoned, streets littered with garbage, crime rising like floodwater with nowhere to drain. The federal government had refused to bail the city out. President Ford's message was clear. New York had made its bed. Now it could lie in it. The famous headline in the Daily News summed it up. Ford 2 City dropped dead. And so the city was dropping dead, slowly and painfully, neighborhood by neighborhood. Raymond lived in the South Bronx with his wife Patricia and their 2 young children. The Bronx had once been a thriving working-class area, full of families and small businesses and community. But by 1975, it looked like something out of a dystopian nightmare. Buildings burned almost every night, sometimes from accidents, more often from arson committed by landlords who'd rather collect insurance money than try to maintain properties in a collapsing economy. Heroin had flooded the streets. Gang violence was constant. The police were overwhelmed and underfunded. People who could afford to leave had already left. Those who remained were trapped. Raymond Cole was 34 years old. He'd served in Vietnam, seen combat, came home expecting, what? He wasn't sure anymore. Benefits, maybe. Opportunities. A chance to build something. Instead, he found a country that had no use for him. The VA was a bureaucratic nightmare that offered nothing. The job market was non-existent, especially for black veterans with no college education and no connections. So Raymond had done what so many desperate men in the Bronx were doing. He turned to the only economy that was actually thriving. Drugs. And he'd been good at it. Good enough to catch the attention of Vic the Enforcer Morales, the kingpin who controlled most of the drug trade from Harlem to the South Bronx. Working for Vic meant real money. It meant being able to feed his family, keep the heat on, give his kids something better than the street corners and burned-out buildings that surrounded them. But it also meant living with a target on his back. On that January night, Raymond sat in his car, breath fogging in the cold air, watching frost spread across the windshield. He was supposed to be meeting someone. A pickup, a delivery, a conversation. The details don't matter now. What matters is that Raymond never saw the shadow approaching from behind his car. The gunshot was quick, professional. The killer disappeared into the darkness before Raymond's body even slumped against the steering wheel. Another murder in New York City. Another case file that would gather dust in a police station basement. Another unsolved homicide in a city drowning in violence. The official investigation was perfunctory at best. The detective who caught the case had 17 other open murders on his desk. There were no witnesses. No physical evidence beyond the bullet and the body. No leads worth pursuing in a neighborhood where nobody talked to cops anyway. But the streets had their own investigation, their own verdict. The word was that Raymond had been arrested 3 years earlier on trafficking charges. That he'd been facing serious time. That somehow, mysteriously, the charges had been reduced and he'd walked away with probation. That several of his associates had been raided and arrested shortly after, while Raymond had remained untouched. The math wasn't complicated. Raymond had flipped. He'd become an informant. He'd traded information for his freedom, and in doing so, he'd signed his own death warrant. Whether it was true or not, nobody could say for certain. Raymond was dead, and the dead don't defend themselves. But in the world he'd operated in, perception was reality. And the perception was that Raymond Cole was a rat who'd sold out his own people to save himself. There'd been a price on his head. Someone had collected. What Raymond left behind that night wasn't just a criminal record and unpaid debts. He left behind a family, a wife who would now have to navigate one of the most dangerous cities in America alone, and 2 children who would grow up with a ghost for a father and a legend for a legacy. Patricia Cole was 28 years old when her husband was murdered. She was a part-time model, catalog work, nothing glamorous, and an elementary school teacher's aide. Between the 2 jobs, she barely made enough to cover rent. Raymond's income, illegal as it was, had been what kept them afloat. Now she was a widow with a 2-year-old daughter named Keisha and a 4-year-old son named Sean. The night the police came to tell her Raymond was dead, Patricia made a decision that would shape the rest of her life, and, more importantly, the rest of her son's life. She would not let her children follow their father's path. She would not let the streets claim them the way they claimed Raymond. Whatever it took, whatever sacrifices she had to make, she would give Sean and Keisha a different future. She started by lying. Sean was too young to understand what had really happened, and Patricia decided he would stay that way. She told him his father had died in a car accident. A tragic, random event. Not murder. Not execution. Not the consequence of a life of crime. It would be nearly 2 decades before Sean learned the truth. And by then, the lie would have already done its damage. Patricia worked herself to exhaustion trying to keep her family alive. She took on a 3rd job, then a 4th. She worked mornings as a teacher's aide, afternoons doing catalog modeling when she could get it, evenings cleaning offices, and weekends doing whatever side work came her way. Some weeks, she slept 4 hours a night. Some weeks, she didn't sleep at all. And still, they lived in poverty. The apartment in the South Bronx was a nightmare. Small, cramped, infested with roaches and rats. The heating barely worked in winter. The plumbing failed regularly. The building itself was falling apart like everything else in the neighborhood. Patricia spent what little money she had on keeping Sean and Keisha fed, clothed, and safe. But safety was relative in the South Bronx in the late 1970s. There were nights when gunshots echoed through the streets. Nights when buildings burned and sirens wailed until dawn. Nights when Patricia lay awake, terrified that something would happen to her children, that she wouldn't be able to protect them from the violence that surrounded them on all sides. Often, when work demanded it, Patricia had no choice but to send Sean and Keisha to stay with her sister in the Patterson housing projects. It was supposed to be temporary. A few nights here and there when Patricia's schedule was too demanding to care for them herself. But the Patterson projects were, if anything, worse than where they lived. The projects were a sprawling complex of towers that had been built with good intentions and had become a monument to urban decay. Overcrowding, poverty, crime, drugs. The elevators rarely worked, so residents had to climb dark stairwells that reeked of urine and were controlled by gangs. The apartments were barely maintained. The city had essentially abandoned the people who lived there. It was in those projects that young Sean Cole experienced something that would stay with him forever. He would later describe waking up one morning with roaches crawling across his face. Not 1 or 2, 15, maybe 20. The apartment was so infested that the insects had stopped hiding. They crawled over everything. Over the walls, over the furniture, over the children sleeping in their beds. That's when I knew, Sean would say years later, dressed in a $5,000 suit, sitting in his penthouse office overlooking Manhattan. I wasn't going to live like this. I was going to be somebody. I was going to own something. I was going to make sure none of us ever lived like that again. It was the kind of story Americans loved. Rags to riches. Poverty to power. The bootstrap narrative that promised anyone could make it if they just worked hard enough. But there was something else in that story. Something darker that nobody wanted to examine too closely. Because it wasn't just ambition forming in that child. It was rage. It was a desperate, clawing hunger that would never be satisfied. It was the belief that the world was divided into predators and prey, and he would never, ever be prey again. Sean also said this in a different interview. It just kind of snapped in me. Don't take less in life. Always fight back. To this day, whenever I get too comfortable, I remember the roaches. I remember living in a situation where babies weren't changed for 2 or 3 days and everything smelled and there was no food. That memory is what really fuels me. Fuel. That was the word he used. As if trauma was just gasoline for the engine of success. As if the degradation and suffering of childhood was simply motivation to be monetized. Nobody asked what else that fuel might be burning. Patricia believed the answer to saving her children was faith and discipline. She raised Sean and Keisha Catholic. They went to church every Sunday without fail. Sean served as an altar boy, standing beside the priest during Mass, learning the rituals and the prayers. Patricia hoped the church would provide what she couldn't: structure, moral guidance, a community that would keep her son away from the streets that had killed his father. And when Sean was old enough, Patricia made the biggest sacrifice of her life. She scraped together every dollar she could save, borrowed from family, worked extra hours, and enrolled Sean in St. Augustine Academy. St. Augustine was an elite, all-boys Catholic institution in Mount Vernon, just outside the Bronx. It had a reputation for academic excellence and strict discipline. It was the kind of school that sent boys to good colleges, that opened doors to futures beyond the decay of New York's dying neighborhoods. It was expensive, far more than Patricia could afford. But she paid anyway because she believed it would save her son. She had no idea what she was actually sending him into. St. Augustine Academy was everything Patricia hoped it would be, at least on the surface. Rigorous academics, structured days, uniforms and rules, and high expectations. Sean was surrounded by boys from better neighborhoods, boys with opportunities, boys whose fathers were alive and whose mothers didn't work for jobs. He learned quickly to navigate that world, to code switch, to present himself as someone who belonged, even when he felt like an outsider. He was charismatic even then, able to make friends and connections, able to read people and give them what they wanted. But St. Augustine also had secrets. Secrets that festered in the hallways and classrooms and dormitories. Secrets that the Catholic Brotherhood running the school protected with the same fierce dedication they claimed to have for education and morality. In 1989, just 1 year after Sean Cole graduated from St. Augustine Academy, the school's headmaster, Father Timothy Walsh, and the senior chaplain, Brother Douglas Brennan, were both indicted on charges of sexual abuse. The investigation, conducted by the FBI and the New York Police Department, revealed that at least 4 boys between the ages of 13 and 15 had been molested over a period of several years. The abuse had been systematic, calculated, hidden behind the authority and sanctity of the church. Father Walsh was eventually sentenced to prison, though he was never formally removed from his position in the Catholic Brotherhood that ran the school. Brother Brennan fled to Chicago before he could be arrested. He found work at another Catholic boys' school there, where he continued his access to vulnerable children. Despite the FBI investigation, despite the overwhelming evidence, only 1 student ever came forward publicly. The others remained silent, bound by shame and fear and the peculiar power the church wielded over its victims. No trial was ever held. The matter was quietly settled and buried. The school remained open. The Brotherhood issued a carefully worded statement expressing regret. And everyone moved on, except the victims. They never moved on. Whether Sean Cole was among those victims, no one knows for certain. He never spoke about it publicly, never filed a complaint, never gave testimony. If something happened to him in the halls of St. Augustine Academy, he took that secret with him into adulthood. But the patterns that would define his later life, the grooming of teenage boys, the obsession with control and domination, the use of power to silence victims, the belief that rules didn't apply to him, all pointed to something unresolved, something broken. Trauma doesn't excuse evil. It can't. If we allow trauma to become an excuse, then we strip victims of their agency and predators of their accountability. But trauma can explain how evil begins. And in the halls of St. Augustine Academy, surrounded by men who preach morality while practicing predation, something fundamental shifted inside Sean Cole. He learned that institutions protected abusers. He learned that power could silence victims. He learned that if you were important enough, respected enough, wealthy enough, you could do terrible things and face no consequences. He learned that the men who hurt people, who destroyed lives, often walked away untouched. And somewhere in that young, hungry, angry boy, a decision was made. If that was how the world worked, then he would master it. He would become the one with power. He would become untouchable. He would become the predator, not the prey. By the time Sean Cole left St. Augustine Academy in 1988, the scared little boy from the South Bronx was gone. The child who'd woken up with roaches on his face, who'd watched his mother work herself to exhaustion, who'd grown up without a father, that child had been hardened into something colder, something calculating. He'd learned the rules of survival in a world that had no mercy for the weak, and he decided that he would never be weak again. Whatever it took, whatever he had to do, whoever he had to hurt, he was going to survive. He was going to succeed. He was going to build an empire, and no one was going to stop him. The monster wasn't fully formed yet. That would take years. But the seed had been planted in the poverty of the South Bronx, watered by his father's violent death, and cultivated in the halls of a Catholic school that preached salvation while practicing damnation. Sean Cole was ready to become Big Daddy. The world just didn't know it yet. As soon as Sean Cole graduated from St. Augustine Academy in 1988, Patricia celebrated. Her son had been accepted into Howard University in Washington, D.C., one of the most prestigious historically black universities in the country. He would study business. He would get his degree. He would build a legitimate career far away from the streets that had killed his father. For Patricia, it was vindication. All the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the multiple jobs, the years of scraping by, had been worth it. Her son was going to make it, the right way. But Sean had other plans. Howard University was never his priority. From the moment he arrived on campus, he was already looking beyond it, already networking, already positioning himself for something bigger. He attended classes sporadically, did the bare minimum to avoid failing, but his real energy went elsewhere, into the music industry. During his freshman year, Sean leveraged a connection from back home, a friendship with a New York rapper he'd met at a party he'd hosted as a teenager, to secure an unpaid internship at Apex Records. Apex was a New York-based label that had exploded in the late 80s, becoming one of the hottest names in R&B and hip-hop. They were signing new talent, producing hits, and printing money. And Sean wanted in. He started calling himself Big Daddy around this time. The name fit his personality, larger than life, commanding, impossible to ignore. He commuted between Washington, D.C., and New York City, sleeping on couches, taking buses at ungodly hours, refusing to let either opportunity slip away. At Apex Records, he started at the absolute bottom. Intern work, the kind of menial tasks that most people would find demeaning. Driving artists like Monique Sterling from her apartment to recording sessions in Manhattan. Picking up coffee orders. Running guest lists for label events. Organizing schedules. It was grunt work. Thankless work. But Big Daddy treated it like an audition. He showed up early. He stayed late. He made himself indispensable. More importantly, he watched everything. He studied how the executives operated, how deals were structured, how talent was managed. He learned who had power and how they wielded it. He absorbed the mechanics of the industry like a student preparing for a test he couldn't afford to fail. And people noticed. Marcus Harrell, the founder of Apex Records, saw something in the young intern that most people missed. It wasn't just ambition. Plenty of young people in the music industry were ambitious. It was the intensity, the hunger, the way Big Daddy operated without boundaries, without the hesitation that held most people back. There was a story that became legend at Apex Records. One day, a producer failed to show up for a recording session with one of the label's new artists. The session was expensive, studio time booked, engineers on the clock, the artist waiting. Thousands of dollars burning while everyone sat around wondering what to do. Big Daddy, who was supposed to be organizing equipment and making sure the artist was comfortable, sat down at the production console himself. He had no formal training. He'd never produced a record before, but he'd been watching, studying, absorbing how it worked. And he had an ear, an instinct for what sounded good, what would sell, what the market wanted. He produced the track himself. It sold 2 million copies. Within a year of starting as an unpaid intern, Big Daddy was promoted to director of talent at Apex Records. He was 21 years old, barely legal drinking age, and suddenly he was one of the most powerful people in the building. He was signing artists, producing records, making decisions that affected careers and millions of dollars. He'd found his calling, and more importantly, he'd found his weapon, power. But even then, in those early days when he was still learning the game, there were signs. Small things that people noticed but dismissed. Behaviors that seemed like personality quirks or the brashness of youth, but that hinted at something darker underneath. Big Daddy had a temper. When things didn't go his way, When someone questioned his decisions or pushed back against his authority, he could turn cold in an instant. The charisma would vanish, replaced by something sharp and threatening. He didn't yell. Yelling was messy, unprofessional. Instead, he would go quiet, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting. Artists who worked with him described feeling simultaneously drawn to him and afraid of him. He had a way of making people feel special, chosen, destined for greatness, and then, just as quickly, making them feel dispensable, worthless, replaceable. He controlled through psychological manipulation rather than brute force. He'd praise someone lavishly one day, building them up, making them feel like the most important person in the world. Then he'd ignore them the next day, or worse, criticize them publicly, tearing down everything he'd built up. The emotional whiplash kept people off balance, desperate for his approval, willing to do almost anything to get back in his good graces. Studio engineers noticed how he interacted with young artists, particularly young male artists. The way he'd keep them close. The way he'd invite them to private meetings, to his apartment, to after-hour sessions that didn't seem to have any clear professional purpose. The way he'd talk about mentoring and shaping talent in ways that felt less about music and more about control. But Big Daddy was making hits. He was making money. And in the music industry, success excused almost everything. Monique Sterling, one of Apex Records' biggest stars, later said in an interview, "Working with Big Daddy was complicated. He was brilliant, no question. He knew how to make a hit record better than anyone I've ever worked with. But there's always this feeling that you owed him something. Like he wasn't just producing your music, he was creating you, and therefore he owned you. It was uncomfortable, but you told yourself it was just the industry. Just how things worked. Just how things worked." That phrase would echo through Big Daddy's entire career. The justification, the normalization, the slow erosion of boundaries until nobody could remember where the line was supposed to be. Big Daddy's parties started around this time, too. He called them Daddy's House, and they quickly became legendary. Every week, sometimes multiple times a week, Big Daddy would rent out a venue, a club, a loft, occasionally his own apartment when he moved into something bigger, and throw parties that attracted over 1,000 people. College students, local kids from the neighborhood, aspiring artists and producers, established rappers and R&B singers, athletes, models, anyone who was someone or who wanted to be someone showed up at Daddy's house. On the surface, they were just parties. Good music, free-flowing alcohol, beautiful people, the kind of scene that defined New York nightlife in the early 90s. But they were never just parties. They were strategic networking events where Big Daddy scouted new talent, made connections, and built his reputation as a larger-than-life figure in the industry. He worked the room like a politician, remembering names, making people feel seen, creating obligations and loyalties that he would later collect on. The parties were also where the darker side of Big Daddy's operation became visible, at least to those paying attention. Excessive drug use. Cocaine and ecstasy were as common as cocktails. People passed out in corners. Underage drinking was rampant. Nobody checked IDs, and even if they had, fake IDs were easy to come by. The parties would stretch into dawn, sometimes lasting entire weekends. And what happened in those later hours, when most people had left and only the inner circle remained, was the subject of whispers and rumors that nobody wanted to confirm publicly. Because confirming them meant losing access. And losing access to Big Daddy meant losing access to the industry. So people looked away. They made excuses. They told themselves that what consenting adults did in private was none of their business, even when some of those adults were clearly teenagers who'd been given fake IDs and too much alcohol and were in way over their heads. Big Daddy was building something, not just a career, but a system, a machine designed to identify vulnerable people, people who wanted something desperately enough to compromise, to stay silent, to accept terms they shouldn't accept, and extract everything from them. And then came December 28th, 1991. The event was supposed to be simple. A charity basketball game at City College of New York, co-hosted by Big Daddy and Calvin Heavy Cal Davis, one of Apex Records' biggest rap stars. The proceeds were meant to benefit AIDS, education, and outreach programs, a cause that was desperately needed in the early 90s as the epidemic ravaged communities. The venue was City College's gymnasium, a modest space with a capacity of about 2,700 people. Tickets had been sold through local outlets, and the event had been heavily promoted on radio stations and through street teams. Nobody had anticipated the turnout. Over 3,000 people showed up that night. The gymnasium couldn't hold them. The lobby was packed. People were pushing, shoving, desperate to get inside to see Heavy Cal perform, to be part of the event, to say they were there. The security was inadequate. The planning was insufficient. The venue was completely unprepared for a crowd of that size. And then someone at the front of the crowd saw what looked like an entrance, a set of swinging doors at the bottom of a stairwell. People rushed forward, thinking it would get them into the gymnasium faster. They didn't realize it wasn't an entrance at all. It was a utility stairwell, a dead end, a narrow corridor that led nowhere. Over 3,000 people surged forward into a space designed for maybe a few dozen. The crowd crush happened in minutes. People at the front were pressed against walls, against doors, against each other with such force that they couldn't breathe. They couldn't move. They couldn't escape. They couldn't scream. In less than 15 minutes, 9 people were dead, crushed, suffocated, trampled. The victims were kids, high school students, college freshmen. The youngest was 15 years old. The oldest was 26. They were from the surrounding neighborhoods, Harlem, the Bronx, Washington Heights. They'd come to see their favorite artists, to have a good time, to be part of something exciting. Instead, they died in a stairwell while a charity basketball game was supposed to be starting upstairs. The media response was immediate and brutal. Headlines screamed about negligence, about greed, about promoters who'd oversold tickets and ignored safety regulations. And because Big Daddy's name was all over the event, he'd promoted it, hosted it, put his brand on it. He became the face of the disaster. He should have owned it. He should have taken responsibility, expressed genuine remorse, done everything possible to help the victims' families. Instead, he made it about himself. In interviews immediately after the tragedy, Big Daddy claimed he'd been devastated. He said he'd contemplated suicide. He described being alone in the gymnasium with the bodies, trying to resuscitate victims, begging them to breathe. "I was there with 9 bodies on the ground," he told a reporter, his voice breaking dramatically. "Nobody else was there. No police, nobody. Just me and 9 bodies. I tried to save them. I tried everything. It ruined my life. After this, I was probably clinically insane. It was a compelling performance. Tragic, raw, human. It was also a lie." Witnesses who were actually there told a different story. They said Big Daddy had been with his entourage when the crush happened, that he'd walked past the chaos without stopping, that he'd seemed more concerned with getting his belongings and leaving them with what was happening to the victims. One survivor, whose older brother died that night, said years later, "He walked right past me. He was with some people from the label, and they were just trying to get out. He didn't look concerned. He didn't stop. I never got any sense of remorse from him. Just, let me get my stuff and get out of here." But the real scandal emerged when investigators looked into the charity aspect of the event. The basketball game had been promoted as a fundraiser for AIDS education. Tickets had been sold with the explicit promise that proceeds would go to community outreach programs. People had paid money, believing they were supporting a good cause. After the tragedy, investigators tried to trace where the money had gone. It was gone. All of it. There was no fund, no donation, no charity that had received a single dollar. And it was unclear whether there had ever been any intention to donate the proceeds at all. The charity event had been a marketing strategy, a way to generate positive publicity and sell tickets. with no actual charitable purpose behind it. The criminal investigation revealed that while City College bore the majority of the blame for failing to adequately prepare for a large crowd, Big Daddy himself was partially responsible. He'd oversold tickets. He'd failed to coordinate with security. He'd promoted the event aggressively without ensuring the venue could handle the response. Several civil lawsuits followed, brought by the victims' families. They were all settled out of court for undisclosed amounts. Big Daddy never admitted wrongdoing. He never apologized directly to the families. The settlements came with non-disclosure agreements that prevented the families from speaking publicly about the terms. The tragedy should have ended Big Daddy's career. It should have been a clear signal that this was someone who prioritized his own interests over human life. Someone who would lie to protect his image. Someone who saw other people as props in his narrative rather than as human beings with value. Instead, it barely slowed him down, because in 1991, Big Daddy was already too valuable. He was producing too many hits, making too much money. He had too many connections, too much momentum. Apex Records couldn't afford to lose him. The industry couldn't afford to lose him. So they looked away. They accepted his excuses. They let him reshape the narrative until the City College stampede became just another tragic accident, a cautionary tale about crowd management rather than a damning indictment of Big Daddy's character. But a judge had ruled that he'd lied. Witnesses had said he'd walked away. The charity money had vanished. 9 people were dead, and Big Daddy had tried to make himself the victim. At best, it revealed him as a narcissistic opportunist. At worst, it revealed something far more sinister, a complete absence of empathy, a willingness to exploit tragedy for personal gain, a fundamental inability to see other human beings as anything other than instruments for his own advancement. The City College stampede was a warning, a flashing red light that should have made everyone stop and ask hard questions about who Big Daddy really was. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked. And Big Daddy learned the most important lesson of his career. If you're powerful enough, if you're valuable enough, if you're connected enough, you can get away with almost anything. Even 9 dead kids couldn't touch him. So he kept rising, kept accumulating power, kept building his empire on a foundation of manipulation, exploitation, and the silence of people who were too afraid or too invested to speak up. By 1992, Big Daddy had left Apex Records. He'd learned everything he needed to learn, made all the connections he needed to make. It was time to build something of his own, something he could control completely. He founded Empire Sound Records in his apartment in Harlem. No office, no staff, just Big Daddy, a phone, and an unshakable belief that he was destined for greatness. Within 5 years, Empire Sound Records would be one of the most powerful labels in hip-hop. Within 10 years, Big Daddy would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Within 20 years, he'd be a billionaire. And with every year, with every success, with every new artist signed, and every new hit produced, the darkness at the center of his empire would grow deeper, more entrenched, more untouchable. Because power doesn't just corrupt. Power protects. And Big Daddy was learning how to use that protection like a weapon. The monster was no longer just forming. It was loose. It was hunting. And nobody was trying to stop it. In 1992, the same year Big Daddy founded Empire Sound Records, a 14-year-old singer named Marcus Raymond signed his first record deal. Marcus was talented, undeniably, extraordinarily talented. He had a voice that could shift from smooth and soulful to powerful and commanding. He had charisma. He had the kind of raw potential that record executives dreamed about discovering. But he was also 14 years old, a child, and the label that signed him decided that what he needed most wasn't music lessons or vocal coaching or time to develop as an artist. What he needed, they decided, was Big Daddy. Lawrence Mitchell, the executive who'd signed Marcus, made the decision personally. He called Big Daddy, who at 26 was already legendary in the industry for his ability to shape artists, to transform raw talent into commercial success. Big Daddy had just left Apex Records to start his own label, but he still took on side projects, still mentored artists for other companies when the opportunity interested him. Marcus Raymond interested him. My friend said, "I can't hit 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove them wrong." Subscribe to Mr. Sammy's Stories for entertaining, story-packed videos. So an arrangement was made. Marcus would move to New York from his home in Tennessee. He would live with Big Daddy in his Harlem apartment for nearly a year. Big Daddy would teach him about the industry, help him develop his sound, introduce him to the right people, shape him into a star. On paper, it made a certain kind of sense. Intense mentorship, immersion in the industry, learning from someone who understood how to make hits. In reality, it was insane. A 14-year-old boy was being sent to live with a 26-year-old man he didn't know. Not just any man, someone whose parties were already notorious for drugs and alcohol and behavior that crossed boundaries. Someone who'd just been involved in a tragedy that killed 9 people. Someone who operated without guardrails, without oversight, without anyone telling him no. Lawrence Mitchell would later try to justify the decision. Marcus was 14, but nothing about him seemed juvenile. I was turning him over to the wildest party guy in the country at an age when I still needed his mother's permission. I didn't know whether I was being irresponsible or having an epiphany. It wasn't an epiphany. It was negligence at best. At worst, it was something far more sinister, a deliberate delivery of a vulnerable child to a predator. Marcus lived in Big Daddy's apartment. He slept there. He ate there. He was there for the parties, for the late-night sessions, for everything that happened behind closed doors when the music stopped and the crowd thinned out. Years later, a journalist named Rebecca Holmes would write a biography that included details about Big Daddy's methods during this period. She described how he groomed stars in an intensely hands-on style. He reinvented their images by helping shape their music and choose their clothes. For better or worse, he sought to control every aspect of an artist's look, sound, and actions. Control. That word again. Always control. Marcus Raymond did become a star. Within a few years, he was one of the biggest names in R&B, selling millions of records, performing for sold-out crowds, living the dream that every young artist chased. But when asked about his time living with Big Daddy, Marcus's answers were always carefully worded, always vague, always accompanied by nervous laughter that didn't quite reach his eyes. In one interview years later, Marcus said, "Big Daddy taught me things about the industry I'll never forget. Experiences I'll never talk about. He keeps secrets, you know? We all keep secrets." The interviewer pressed, "What kind of secrets?" Marcus's smile disappeared. "The kind you don't talk about on television." In another interview, Marcus was asked directly, "Would you let your own son, if you had one, live with Big Daddy at 14? The pause was long, uncomfortable. Finally, Marcus said quietly, No, I wouldn't." He never elaborated. He never filed charges. He never publicly accused Big Daddy of anything specific. But the subtext was deafening. Something had happened in that apartment. Something that Marcus carried with him, that shaped him, that he would never fully articulate. And Big Daddy? He talked about mentoring Marcus with pride. He pointed to Marcus's success as evidence of his brilliance as a developer of talent. He never acknowledged anything inappropriate. Why would he? Marcus had become exactly what Big Daddy promised. A star. That the star was damaged, traumatized, carrying secrets that made him uncomfortable in his own skin. That wasn't Big Daddy's problem. That was just the cost of success. By 1993, Empire Sound Records was operational, and Big Daddy was hunting for his first major signing. He needed someone who could put his label on the map, someone with undeniable talent and commercial appeal, someone he could shape, control, and build an empire around. He found Christopher Wallace. Wallace was a young rapper from Brooklyn, 21 years old, with a voice like gravel and honey and a storytelling ability that was already legendary in underground circles. He was raw, hungry, and desperate for a chance. He'd been dealing drugs, living the street life, trying to support his daughter and his mother. Music was his way out. Big Daddy saw the potential immediately. More than that, he saw someone he could own. He signed Wallace to Empire Sound Records and gave him a new name, Deshaun Big Truth Williams. He produced his first album. He shaped his image, the clothes, the persona, the whole package. He introduced him to the right producers, the right features, the right radio DJs. Within a year, Big Truth was one of the biggest names in hip-hop. His debut album sold millions. He was on magazine covers. He was making money hand over fist. Except he wasn't. Big Truth's contract with Empire Sound Records was notoriously exploitative. The standard industry contract at the time was bad enough. Labels typically took the majority of profits, leaving artists with a small percentage. But Big Truth's contract was worse than standard. Much worse. He was making millions of dollars for Empire Sound Records while seeing only a fraction of it himself. The contract gave Big Daddy control over almost everything: publishing rights, merchandising, touring, features with other artists. Big Truth couldn't make a move without Big Daddy's approval. Friends said Big Truth felt trapped. He'd talk about wanting to renegotiate his contract, about feeling like he was being robbed, about the success feeling hollow when he saw how little of it actually belonged to him. But Big Daddy didn't just control Big Truth's money. He controlled his life. He dictated what Big Truth wore, who he collaborated with, where he went, who he talked to. He inserted himself into Big Truth's personal relationships, his friendships, his family dynamics. He isolated Big Truth from anyone who might encourage him to push back, to demand better terms, to leave. It wasn't management. It was possession. And Big Truth, despite being one of the most famous rappers in the world, lived in fear of the man who'd made him famous. Fear of losing everything. Fear of being replaced. Fear of Big Daddy's temper, his vindictiveness, his ability to destroy careers as easily as he'd built them. In interviews, Big Truth would sometimes hint at the reality of his situation. He'd make jokes that weren't quite jokes about being owned, about being a slave to his contract, about Big Daddy being a puppet master. People laughed. They thought it was just rap bravado, exaggeration for effect. It wasn't. Then, on March 9th, 1997, Christopher Wallace, Big Truth, was shot and killed in Los Angeles. He was 24 years old. He was sitting in an SUV at a red light when a car pulled up alongside him and someone opened fire. Multiple gunshots. Wallace was hit 4 times. He was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead within the hour. The murder sent shockwaves through the music industry. Big Truth had been at the peak of his career. His second album was about to drop. He was supposed to tour. He was supposed to be the future of hip-hop. Instead, he was dead. The investigation went nowhere. Despite dozens of witnesses, despite the murder happening in a busy part of Los Angeles, despite the high-profile nature of the victim, the case went cold almost immediately. No arrests, no suspects publicly named, no closure, but the rumors started immediately, and they never stopped. Some people said it was connected to the East Coast-West Coast rap rivalry that had been manufactured by record labels to sell albums. Some said it was retaliation for another rapper's murder 6 months earlier. Some said it was gang-related, a consequence of Wallace's past life on the streets. And some people said Big Daddy had something to do with it. Not that he pulled the trigger, nobody claimed that, but that he benefited. That Big Truth had been trying to leave Empire Sound Records, trying to renegotiate his contract, try to break free. That he'd become more trouble than he was worth. That his death, convenient as it was tragic, solved several problems for Big Daddy. Nothing was ever proven. No evidence ever emerged to support those theories. Big Truth's murder remains officially unsolved to this day. But here's what is provable. Big Daddy made more money off Big Truth dead than he ever paid him alive. He owned the masters. He controlled the estate. When Big Truth's posthumous album dropped, it sold millions of copies. Every dollar went through Empire Sound Records, through Big Daddy's accounts, through the contracts that Big Truth had signed when he was young and desperate and didn't know any better. Big Daddy cried at the funeral. He gave emotional eulogies. He produced tribute albums. He dedicated awards to Big Truth's memory. He talked about their friendship, their brotherhood, how much he'd loved him. And he collected checks from a dead man's music for the next 2 decades. The exploitation didn't end with death. If anything, it intensified. Big Truth couldn't renegotiate anymore, couldn't demand better terms, couldn't push back. He was the perfect artist now, profitable, silent, and completely under control. Years later, Big Truth's mother would speak about feeling powerless, about watching Big Daddy profit from her son's death while she struggled financially, about the contract being so airtight that even she, as his mother, had almost no say in how his legacy was managed. "He took everything from my son," she said in an interview, "while he was alive and after he was gone. Everything." If Big Truth's story was a tragedy, Jamal Blaze Carter's story was an abandonment. Carter was a young rapper signed to Empire Sound Records in 1998. He was 21 years old, talented, hungry for success. Big Daddy had promised to make him a star, to give him the same treatment he'd given Big Truth. Instead, he threw him away like garbage. On December 27, 1999, Carter was at a nightclub in Manhattan with Big Daddy and several other Empire Sound artists. It was the kind of scene Big Daddy loved: cameras, celebrities, the energy of being seen. They were celebrating something. An album release, a successful year. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that gunfire erupted in the club. 3 people were injured. Chaos. Screaming. People running for exits. Blood on the floor. When the police arrived, they found an illegal weapon. They arrested Carter. The prosecution built a case. Witnesses who'd seen Carter with a gun, ballistics that potentially matched, motive based on an altercation earlier in the night. Carter maintained his innocence. He said he didn't have a gun, that he wasn't the shooter, that he was being set up, being made a scapegoat because he was young and black and didn't have the resources to fight back properly. But here's what mattered most. Big Daddy had been there, right next to Carter, in the VIP section when the shots were fired. And when the trial began, Big Daddy vanished. He didn't testify, not for the prosecution, not for the defense. He didn't appear in court. He didn't help with legal fees, not directly anyway. He hired the best lawyers money could buy, but they were for himself, to make sure his name stayed clear of the whole mess. He released carefully worded statements through his publicist. Empire Sound Records is cooperating fully with law enforcement. We are deeply saddened by this tragedy and hope justice is served. Corporate, distant, empty. Meanwhile, Carter was facing a decade in prison. His career was over before it had really begun. His life was being destroyed. And the man who'd promised to mentor him, to make him a star, to have his back, that man was nowhere to be found. Carter's public defender was overworked and under-resourced. The prosecution had witnesses, evidence, and a narrative that was easy for a jury to believe. Young rapper, illegal weapon, gang culture, violence. The defense had Carter's word and not much else. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Carter was found guilty of attempted murder and weapons charges. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Big Daddy released another statement. "We are disappointed by today's verdict. Mr. Carter's actions do not reflect the values of Empire Sound Records. We wish him well in his rehabilitation." That was it. No financial support for appeals. No public defense of Carter's character. No acknowledgement that Big Daddy had been there that night, that he might have information that could help, that he had any responsibility whatsoever. Carter served 10 years. Every single day. When he was released in 2009, he tried to restart his music career. But Empire Sound Records still technically owned his contract. They wouldn't release him. They wouldn't put out his music. They wouldn't let him record for anyone else. He was trapped in limbo, punished for a crime he'd already served time for, still controlled by a label that had abandoned him when he needed them most. Eventually, Carter gave up. He took a job working security. He faded into obscurity. His dreams of being a rapper died in that courtroom, and the man who'd promised to make those dreams come true never looked back. In a 2015 interview, Carter finally spoke publicly about Big Daddy. He used me. Simple as that. When I was useful, when I could make money, I was family. He called me his little brother. He said he'd take care of me. Then the second I became a liability, the second I was in trouble and needed him, I didn't exist anymore. That's who Big Daddy really is. He doesn't see people. He sees assets. And when an asset stops being profitable, he discards it. The interviewer asked if he'd ever gotten an apology or even an explanation. Carter laughed, bitter, hollow. An apology? From Big Daddy? He probably doesn't even remember my name. By the end of the 1990s, the pattern was impossible to deny for anyone paying attention. Young artists came to Empire Sound Records with dreams. They were groomed, controlled, and exploited. Their contracts were designed to enrich Big Daddy while keeping them dependent and powerless. They made millions for the label while seeing only a fraction themselves. And when they became inconvenient, whether through death, imprisonment, or simply trying to break free, Big Daddy discarded them without hesitation. Marcus Raymond, the 14-year-old sent to live with him, became a star but carried secrets that haunted him. Big Truth, the biggest success story, died young under mysterious circumstances, and Big Daddy profited from his death for decades. Jamal Carter was abandoned the moment he stopped being useful, left to rot in prison while Big Daddy protected himself and moved on to the next artist. This wasn't a music label. It was a machine designed to identify vulnerable people, extract everything valuable from them, and dispose of them when they were used up. And Big Daddy wasn't a mentor. He was a predator with a business model. The most disturbing part wasn't even the individual stories, as horrific as they were. It was the system, the machinery of exploitation that Big Daddy had built, refined, and perfected. The contracts that trapped artists legally. The NDAs that silenced victims. The power dynamics that made people too afraid to speak up. The industry complicity that allowed it all to continue. Everyone knew. Maybe not the details, maybe not the full extent, but everyone knew something was wrong. Artists whispered about it. Producers hinted at it. Industry insiders made jokes that weren't quite jokes. But Big Daddy was making money. He was producing hits. He was powerful, connected, untouchable. And in the music industry, in any industry built on power and profit, that was enough. The warnings were ignored. The victims were silenced. The machine kept running. And Big Daddy kept hunting for new talent to feed into it. Because that's what predators do. They don't stop. They don't feel remorse. They don't wake up one day and decide to change. They just get better at hiding, better at justifying, better at building systems that protect them while destroying everyone else. The empire was growing, and it was built on bodies. By the early 2000s, Sean Cole, Big Daddy, had everything he'd ever wanted. Empire Sound Records was a household name. The label had produced dozens of platinum albums. Big Daddy himself was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He appeared on magazine covers, gave commencement speeches at colleges, was interviewed by mainstream media outlets that treated him like a visionary entrepreneur rather than a music executive. He had money. He had power. He had influence that extended far beyond the music industry into fashion, spirits, media, and technology. He was building a business empire that would eventually be valued at over $1 billion. He had everything except the one thing he wanted most: respect as an artist. Because for all his success as a producer, executive, and businessman, Big Daddy harbored a secret ambition that gnawed at him constantly. He wanted to be a rapper, not the man behind the scenes pulling strings and collecting checks. He wanted to be the star. He wanted to be on stage, in the spotlight, celebrated not for what he'd built, but for who he was as an artist. He wanted to be Big Truth. He wanted the adoration, the credibility, the street respect that came with being a real MC. So in 2001, after years of producing other people's records, and making other people famous, Big Daddy released his debut album as a solo artist. It was a disaster. Commercially, it did fine. Big Daddy's promotional machine was powerful enough to move units. He could get radio play, music videos on MTV, features in magazines. He had the money and connections to manufacture the appearance of success. But critically, authentically, in the places where hip-hop culture actually lived and breathed, he was a joke. The reviews were brutal. Critics called the album uninspired, derivative, more business plan than artistry. Hip-hop purists tore it apart on message boards and in magazines. The streets didn't accept him. Underground DJs didn't play his music. Real MCs didn't take him seriously. He wasn't a rapper, they said. He was a businessman playing dress-up. He was a suit pretending to be street. He had money and power, but he didn't have authenticity. He didn't have soul. He didn't have the thing that couldn't be bought or manufactured. The respect to the culture. And they were right. Because here's what nobody knew at the time, what wouldn't come out until years later when former employees started talking. Big Daddy hadn't even written most of his own verses. He'd hired ghostwriters, multiple ghostwriters, real rappers, talented lyricists who needed money and were willing to sign NDAs. They wrote the bars. They crafted the flows. They created the personas and the punchlines. Big Daddy just performed them, reading lyrics off paper in the recording booth, doing take after take until he got it right. Even his signature songs, the ones he performed at award shows, the ones he built his public persona around, the ones that were supposed to prove he belonged in the same conversation as the artists he'd signed, weren't actually his. It was all performance, all image, all smoke and mirrors. The man who'd made a career out of shaping other people's artistry, who'd positioned himself as a tastemaker and a genius, had no genuine creative talent of his own. He was a curator, a businessman, a brand. But he wasn't an artist, no matter how desperately he wanted to be. The revelation, when it finally came out years later through interviews with former Empire Sound employees, was humiliating. Websites picked apart his verses, identifying which ghostwriter had probably written which song. Hip-hop fado moquette he met silets. The credibility he'd been trying to build was destroyed in an instant. But by then, Big Daddy had mostly stopped trying to be a rapper anyway. The failure had stung too much. The rejection had been too public. So he'd retreated back into what he was good at, building a business empire and controlling other people's careers. If he couldn't be an artist, he'd settle for owning artists. My friend said, I can't hit 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove them wrong. Subscribe to Mr. Sammy's Stories for entertaining, story-packed videos. And by the mid-2000s, that empire was starting to crumble. Artists were leaving Empire Sound Records in droves. Some walked away quietly, paying enormous sums to buy out their contracts just to escape Big Daddy's control. Others left more dramatically, going public with stories of exploitation, stolen royalties, and psychological manipulation. Monique Sterling, one of the label's first major stars, sued Empire Sound Records in 2004. Her lawsuit claimed she'd been paid less than 5% of what she'd actually earned over her decade with the label. The legal filings revealed a pattern of predatory contracts designed to keep artists financially dependent no matter how successful they became. The contract gave Empire Sound Records control over almost everything: publishing rights, merchandising, touring revenue, even money from features with other artists. The accounting was deliberately opaque, making it nearly impossible for artists to track what they were actually owed. And buried in the fine print were clauses that allowed the label to recoup expenses that mysteriously seemed to grow every year, eating up whatever profits the artists were supposed to receive. Sterling's lawsuit detailed years of promises and delays. Big Daddy telling her the money was coming, that the accounting was complicated, that she needed to be patient. Meanwhile, she'd see him buying new mansions, new cars, throwing parties that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The label was printing money off her music, and she was struggling to pay her rent. The lawsuit was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. Part of the settlement was a non-disclosure agreement that prevented Sterling from discussing the terms publicly. But the damage was done. The lawsuit had exposed Empire Sound's business practices in court filings that journalists could access and report on. Other artists started coming forward with similar stories. A producer who'd worked on multiple platinum albums but had never received proper credit or payment. A songwriter who'd been promised royalties that never materialized. An artist who'd been dropped from the label after refusing to sign an extension on his exploitative contract, then found himself unable to get signed anywhere else because Big Daddy had quietly blackballed him, using his industry connections to make sure no other label would touch him. The pattern was clear. Empire Sound Records wasn't just bad at business. The exploitation was the business model. The contracts were designed to trap artists. The accounting was designed to confuse and deceive. The whole operation was built on taking advantage of desperate, talented people who didn't know any better and didn't have the resources to fight back. And Big Daddy presided over all of it, smiling for cameras and giving interviews about his success story while artists he'd exploited struggled financially and emotionally. But it wasn't just money. Artists weren't just leaving. Some of them were dying. Andre Ace Martinez died in 2003. He was 29 years old. Officially, it was a car accident. His vehicle had wrapped around a tree on a straight stretch of road outside Los Angeles. It was late at night. There was no evidence of other vehicles. The police report concluded he'd been driving too fast, lost control, and crashed. Case closed. Except friends said Ace had been terrified in the weeks before his death. He'd been trying to leave Empire Sound Records. He'd hired a lawyer, started looking at his contract, realized how badly he'd been exploited. He'd told people he was going to go public, that he was going to sue, that he wasn't going to let Big Daddy control him anymore. He'd also said something that haunted the people who heard it. Big Daddy told me he'd never let me go. He said Empire Sound made me, and Empire Sound owns me. He said if I tried to leave, I'd regret it. 2 weeks later, Ace was dead. The investigation was brief. The case was closed quickly. There was no evidence of foul play, the police said. Just a tragic accident. But the people who knew Ace never believed it. The timing was too convenient. The circumstances were too suspicious. And Big Daddy's reaction was too cold. A generic statement of condolences, a tribute performance at an awards show, and then business as usual. Like with Big Truth, Big Daddy owned Ace's masters. Like with Big Truth, Ace's death meant Big Daddy controlled everything with no possibility of the artist ever renegotiating or pushing back. Like with Big Truth, Big Daddy made money off a dead man's music for years afterward. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Then there was Jamal Blaze Carter, who'd been abandoned to prison in 1999. He was released in 2009 after serving his full 10-year sentence. No early release, no reduction. Every day of his sentence, while Big Daddy lived in luxury and Carter's youth and dreams rotted away in his cell. When Carter got out, he tried to restart his music career. He still had talent. He still had hunger. Prison hadn't killed his love for hip-hop. But Empire Sound Records still owned his contract. The same contract he'd signed when he was 21 years old, before the shooting, before the trial, before everything fell apart. Carter called Big Daddy's office, trying to get a meeting. He wanted to discuss releasing new music, getting back in the studio, salvaging something from the wreckage of his life. His calls weren't returned. He tried reaching out through other people at the label, through mutual friends, through lawyers. He wanted Empire Sound either to put out his music or to release him from his contract so he could sign with someone else. The label didn't neither. They wouldn't release his music. Carter wasn't profitable anymore, wasn't marketable, had been away too long. But they also wouldn't release him from his contract. They owned him, and they were going to keep owning him out of pure spite or indifference, or just because they could. Carter was trapped. He couldn't move forward, couldn't record for anyone else, couldn't build a new career. He was frozen in place by a contract he'd signed a decade earlier, still controlled by a man who'd abandoned him when he needed help most. Eventually, Carter stopped trying. He gave up on music entirely. He took a job working security at office buildings. He faded into obscurity, just another cautionary tale about the music industry that nobody would remember in 5 years. In a 2015 interview with a small hip-hop blog, Carter finally spoke openly. "Big Daddy destroyed my life. Not just my career, my life. I lost everything because of that night in the club. I did my time. I paid my debt to society. But I'm still being punished because Big Daddy won't let go. He doesn't even care about me. I'm not making him money. I'm not useful to him. But he won't release me because I don't even know why. Because he can? Because he's cruel? Because hurting people means nothing to him." The interviewer asked if Carter had any message for Big Daddy. Carter was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I hope he dies alone. I hope when his time comes, he realizes that all the money, all the power, all the success, none of it meant anything. Because he never connected with anyone. Not really. He just used people and threw them away. And you can't buy your way out of that kind of emptiness." By 2010, Empire Sound Records was a shell of what had been. The hits had dried up. The new artists Big Daddy signed weren't connecting with audiences. The label's reputation was toxic. Talented artists didn't want to sign there because they'd heard the stories. The ones who did sign were usually desperate, out of options, willing to accept terrible terms because nobody else was offering anything. The glory days of the late 90s and early 2000s, when Empire Sound had dominated hip-hop and R&B, were over. The label still existed, still released music occasionally, but it wasn't a cultural force anymore. It was a brand trading on past successes while the present crumbled. Big Daddy pivoted. He started focusing on other business ventures, fashion, alcohol brands, media companies. He positioned himself as a mogul rather than a music executive. He gave TED Talks about entrepreneurship. He appeared on business shows talking about building empires and creating generational wealth. He became famous, for being rich, for being Big Daddy. The actual source of his wealth, the exploitation of artists, the predatory contracts, the destruction of young people's dreams, was quietly buried under layers of branding and public relations. But industry insiders knew. Artists knew. Anyone paying attention knew that Empire Sound Records had been built on broken bodies and stolen futures. Marcus Raymond, the singer who'd lived with Big Daddy as a 14-year-old, did an interview in 2012 for a music magazine. The interview was mostly about his current album, his tour, his creative process. But toward the end, the interviewer asked about his early career, about his time being mentored by Big Daddy. Marcus's entire demeanor changed. The easy smile disappeared. His body language became guarded. "Big Daddy taught me a lot," Marcus said carefully. "About the industry, about how things really work, about power and control, and what people will do when they think they can get away with it." "Would you work with him again?" the interviewer asked. Marcus looked directly at the camera. His voice was quiet but steady. "No, absolutely not. And if I had a son, I'd never let him anywhere near Big Daddy. Ever." The interview went viral. People dissected those 20 seconds of footage frame by frame. Marcus's expression, his tone, the deliberate choice of words. He hadn't made any specific accusations, nothing that could get him sued for defamation. But he'd made his position crystal clear. Other artists started making similar statements. Never anything actionable. Never anything specific enough to constitute legal grounds for a lawsuit. But enough to paint a picture. Enough to confirm what people have been whispering about for years. Trevor Mason, another artist who'd been brought into Big Daddy's world as a teenager, posted on social media in 2014. "Therapy is helping me work through a lot. Some wounds take decades to heal. Some people leave scars you carry forever. But I'm learning that survival is its own kind of victory." When fans asked what he was referring to, he didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. By 2015, Empire Sound Records was essentially dormant. The office still existed. The website still functioned. But there were no new signings, no new releases, no activity that suggested a functioning record label. Big Daddy had moved on. He was focused on his other businesses, his media appearances, his personal brand. He was worth over $1 billion now, most of it from ventures that had nothing to do with music anymore. But the legacy of Empire Sound Records remained. The artists whose careers had been destroyed. The families mourning dead sons. The young men carrying trauma they'd never fully articulate. If you enjoy dramatic, jaw-dropping stories, subscribe to Mr. Sammy's Stories. Let's grow this channel to 1,000 subscribers. The empire Big Daddy had built wasn't built on innovation or artistry or talent. It was built on exploitation, on predatory contracts, on taking advantage of desperate, talented people and extracting everything valuable from them before discarding them like trash. He wasn't a visionary. He wasn't a mogul in any admirable sense. He was a predator with a business license and good PR. And for years, decades, he'd gotten away with it because success had made him untouchable. Money had bought silence. Power had purchased complicity. The industry had looked the other way because Big Daddy was profitable, and profit excused almost anything. The artists who tried to speak out were silenced by NDAs and fear and the knowledge that Big Daddy's lawyers were better than theirs. The journalists who tried to investigate ran into walls of corporate opacity and threatened lawsuits. The few stories that made it to publication were dismissed as disgruntled artists blaming their failures on the label rather than their own shortcomings. The machine protected itself. The system defended its own. But empires built on hollow foundations eventually collapse. And by 2015, the cracks were visible to anyone paying attention. Big Daddy's reputation in the music industry was destroyed. His wealth was intact. His business ventures continued, but the credibility was gone. People knew who he really was, what he'd really done. They just didn't care enough to do anything about it. Until 2023, when a woman named Jasmine Cruz decided she was done being silent. And everything Big Daddy had built started to crumble. Not because the system finally worked. Not because justice naturally prevailed. But because one victim refused to stay quiet, and her courage gave others permission to speak. The hollow empire was about to collapse. And underneath the rubble would be bodies, so many bodies, that the world had been content to ignore while Big Daddy smiled for the cameras and collected his awards. In November 2023, Jasmine Cruz walked into a lawyer's office in Manhattan and made a decision that would change everything. For 11 years, she'd been trapped in a relationship with Sean Cole. Trapped is the right word. Not dating, not involved with, but trapped. She'd been a singer, young and talented, signed to Empire Sound Records in 2007 when she was 19 years old. Big Daddy had taken an interest in her immediately. Personal interest. The kind that made other people at the label exchange knowing looks and saying nothing. Within months of signing, she was his girlfriend. Within a year, she was living in his world completely. Isolated from friends and family, dependent on him financially, controlled in ways she didn't fully recognize until much later. For 11 years, she endured systematic abuse. Physical violence that left bruises she had to hide. Sexual coercion that she couldn't name as assault because he was her boyfriend, wasn't he? Psychological manipulation so thorough that she sometimes couldn't remember who she'd been before him. And when she finally escaped in 2018, when she finally managed to leave, she'd signed an NDA as part of the separation. Big Daddy's lawyers had made it clear. Stay silent or face legal consequences that would destroy her. She'd taken the money, not hush money, they called it settlement, and she'd stayed quiet. For 5 years, she stayed quiet while Big Daddy continued building his empire, continued smiling for cameras, continued being celebrated as a success story. But in November 2023, Jasmine Cruz decided she was done protecting him. The lawsuit she filed was 35 pages long. It was specific, detailed, and devastating. It described years of physical abuse, being hit, kicked, choked. It described forced participation in sexual acts she hadn't consented to, sometimes involving other people she didn't know. It described a system of surveillance and control, Big Daddy tracking her location, reading her messages, controlling who she could see and talk to. It described how he'd use his wealth and power as weapons, how he'd threaten to destroy her career if she left, how he'd remind her that he owned her contract, owned her music, owned her future, how he'd isolated her so completely that she had nowhere to turn, no one to help. The lawsuit wasn't just about domestic violence, though that would have been damning enough. It went further. It described a pattern of behavior that suggested Big Daddy had been running a criminal operation disguised as a music label and business empire. The allegations included sex trafficking. The lawsuit claimed Big Daddy had coerced Jasmine and others into participating in elaborate, drug-fueled events he orchestrated, events where consent was manufactured through manipulation, substances, and power dynamics that made refusal impossible. The lawsuit described how Big Daddy would record these encounters without consent and use the recordings as leverage, as insurance, as blackmail to ensure continued compliance and silence. It described payments to women who'd been coerced into participating. Payments that looked like modeling fees or appearance fees, but were actually compensation for things they'd been forced to do. It described a network of enablers, assistants who booked hotel rooms, staff who procured drugs, lawyers who drafted NDAs, accountants who disguised payments. An entire infrastructure built to facilitate and cover up abuse. The lawsuit was filed in federal court. Within hours, it was public record. Within days, it was international news. Big Daddy's team responded immediately with denials. His lawyers released a statement. Mr. Cole vehemently denies these allegations, which are entirely false and appear to be motivated by financial gain. We will defend vigorously against these baseless claims. But the statement rang hollow, because Jasmine Cruz wasn't alone. Within a week of her lawsuit going public, other women started coming forward. Not with lawsuits at first, just with statements to journalists, posts on social media, carefully worded acknowledgments that they'd experienced similar things. A former assistant who'd worked at Empire Sound Records from 2009 to 2012. She'd signed an NDA when she left, but seeing Jasmine's courage made her willing to break it. She described being asked to arrange meetings for Big Daddy that were clearly something else. Booking hotel suites, ensuring alcohol and drugs were available, coordinating transportation for young women who looked uncomfortable and scared. A backup singer who'd worked on multiple Empire Sound projects in the early 2000s. She described parties at Big Daddy's mansion where boundaries dissolved and saying no wasn't really an option. Not if you wanted to keep working, not if you wanted your career to survive. A producer who'd been at some of those parties. He described witnessing things that disturbed him. Young women who seemed impaired being led into private rooms. Big Daddy's security ensuring nobody interfered or asked questions. He'd stayed silent for years out of fear and complicity, but he couldn't stay silent anymore. The stories were disturbingly similar. The same tactics, the same manipulation, the same infrastructure of enablers making it all possible. This wasn't one bad relationship. This wasn't one isolated incident of abuse. This was systematic. This was calculated. This was a machine that had been operating for decades. And then, on March 25th, 2024, the federal government made it clear they'd been watching. At 6 a.m., Department of Homeland Security agents, accompanied by FBI personnel and local law enforcement, executed simultaneous raids on 3 of Big Daddy's properties. His mansion in Los Angeles, his waterfront estate in Miami, and his penthouse in Manhattan. The operation was massive. Dozens of agents, tactical gear, search warrants that gave him access to everything: computers, phones, financial records, security footage, documents. By 8 a.m., news helicopters were circling Big Daddy's Los Angeles mansion, broadcasting live footage of agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the house. The images were everywhere within hours. Big Daddy's empire, his carefully constructed image of success and legitimacy, was being literally dismantled on live television. The Department of Homeland Security Investigations released a brief statement. Earlier today, Homeland Security Investigations New York executed law enforcement actions as part of an ongoing investigation, with assistance from HSI Los Angeles, HSI Miami, and local law enforcement partners. We will provide further information as it becomes available. That was it. No details about what they were investigating. No confirmation of targets or suspects. Just that clinical, bureaucratic language that somehow made it more ominous. But the timing and scale made it clear. This was about Big Daddy. This was about the allegations in Jasmine's lawsuit. And this was serious. Homeland Security doesn't conduct raids like that for civil matters. They don't bring tactical teams and execute simultaneous multi-state operations for contract disputes or domestic violence cases. They do that for trafficking, for racketeering, for organized criminal enterprises. Within days, more information started leaking. Anonymous sources told journalists that prosecutors had been building a case for months, long before Jasmine's lawsuit went public, that they had surveillance footage from hotels, financial records showing payments that looked like hush money, communications that outlined patterns of coercion and control, that they had testimony from multiple witnesses, employees, former associates, people who'd been part of Big Daddy's orbit and had been quietly cooperating with investigators, that they were treating Empire Sound Records not as a legitimate business, but as a front for criminal activity. The investigation had apparently started years earlier, triggered by complaints that had been dismissed or buried at local levels, but had eventually reached federal prosecutors who took them seriously. They'd been patient, methodical, building a case that would be airtight, gathering evidence that would be undeniable. And now they were ready. On September 16, 2024, Sean Cole was arrested at a hotel in Manhattan. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't on the run. He was in New York for business meetings, staying at a luxury hotel, operating as if nothing had changed, as if the lawsuits and the raids and the mounting evidence were just temporary obstacles that his lawyers and his money would eventually make disappear. Federal agents arrested him in the lobby. There were cameras. There are always cameras when someone that famous gets arrested. The footage showed Big Daddy in an expensive suit, looking shocked, and then angry as he was handcuffed and led away. The indictment was unsealed hours later. It was devastating. The charges included sex trafficking, racketeering conspiracy, and transportation for purposes of prostitution. The indictment described a pattern of abuse spanning more than 30 years. It named Big Daddy as the leader of a criminal enterprise that used Empire Sound Records and his other businesses as fronts for systematic exploitation. The indictment described what prosecutors called freak-offs, elaborate, coerced sexual performances that Big Daddy orchestrated, recorded, and used as leverage against participants. It detailed how he'd use his wealth and power to transport victims across state lines, to book hotel rooms where these events took place, to provide drugs that impaired judgment and resistance. It described how Big Daddy would record these encounters without consent and keep the recordings as insurance, evidence he could use to ensure silence, to threaten anyone who might consider speaking out, to maintain control long after the abuse had occurred. The indictment detailed financial records showing payments to victims disguised as legitimate business expenses. It showed communications between Big Daddy and his employees arranging logistics for these events. It included testimony from former staff members who'd been ordered to facilitate abuse and had finally decided to cooperate with investigators. And it went beyond the sexual abuse. The racketeering charges encompassed the entire operation. The predatory contracts that trapped artists, the systematic theft of royalties, the use of NDAs to silence victims, the blackballing of artists who try to leave, the network of enablers who'd helped Big Daddy operate with impunity for decades. Prosecutors weren't just going after Big Daddy for what he'd done to Jasmine Cruz or to other women who'd come forward. They were going after the entire empire. They were arguing that everything, the record label, the business ventures, the wealth and success, had been built on exploitation and maintained through criminal conduct. The bail hearing was brief. Big Daddy's lawyers argued he wasn't a flight risk, that he had too many ties to the community, that he deserved to remain free while preparing his defense. The prosecutor argued otherwise. She described the evidence they had: surveillance footage showing Big Daddy dragging Jasmine Cruz down a hotel hallway, her trying to escape his grip; financial records documenting decades of payments to silence victims; witness testimony from people who'd watched Big Daddy operate above the law for their entire careers. The defendant has spent 30 years building a system designed to exploit vulnerable people, the prosecutor said. He has used his wealth to silence victims and his power to escape consequences. He has destroyed lives without remorse, and he has demonstrated repeatedly that he believes rules don't apply to him. He is a danger to the community and should be detained pending trial. The judge agreed. Bail was denied. Big Daddy was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. The man who'd built a billion-dollar empire, who'd been celebrated as a success story, who'd given speeches about achieving the American dream, was going to jail. Not prison yet. He hadn't been convicted, but jail pending trial. The Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. A concrete cell. No luxury. No power. No control. For the first time in his life, Big Daddy was just another defendant. The trial was set for May 2025. But even before it began, the consequences were cascading. Corporate partners started severing ties. A major spirits company dropped Big Daddy's vodka brand. A streaming service canceled his reality show. Universities rescinded honorary degrees. Organizations that had celebrated him as a philanthropist quietly removed his name from buildings and programs. More victims came forward. Not just women, but men. Young men who'd been part of Big Daddy's orbit as teenagers, who'd been groomed and abused and threatened into silence. Their stories were remarkably consistent with each other and with the patterns described in the indictment. Marcus Raymond, the singer who'd lived with Big Daddy at age 14, finally spoke publicly. In a statement released through his lawyer, he described years of abuse that he'd been too ashamed and afraid to disclose. He described how Big Daddy had manipulated him, isolated him, and exploited him. How the success of his music career had come at a cost he was still paying decades later. I was a child, Marcus's statement read. I trusted the adults around me to protect me. Instead, I was delivered to a predator. And when I tried to speak about it later, I was told it would destroy my career, that nobody would believe me, that Big Daddy's lawyers would bury me. So I stayed silent. But I'm done being silent. Whatever happens now, I'm done protecting the man who destroyed my childhood. Trevor Mason released a similar statement. So did others. The trickle of accusations became a flood. If you enjoy dramatic, jaw-dropping stories, subscribe to Mr. Sammy's Stories. Let's grow this channel to 1,000 subscribers. And the investigators kept digging. They were looking at everyone who'd enabled Big Daddy. The assistants who'd booked the hotel rooms. The staff who'd procured the drugs. The lawyers who'd drafted the NDAs. The accountants who'd disguised the payments. The label executives who'd ignored the warning signs. Some of them started cooperating, cutting deals to testify against Big Daddy in exchange for leniency. The network of complicity was unraveling, each person trying to save themselves by exposing others. The evidence kept mounting. Hotel surveillance footage from multiple cities showing Big Daddy with victims who appeared impaired or distressed. Text messages and emails coordinating abuse. Financial records showing millions of dollars paid to silence victims over the years. Prosecutors called it one of the most extensive sex trafficking and racketeering cases they'd ever built. Defense lawyers called it a witch hunt fueled by people seeking money and revenge. But the evidence spoke for itself. As the trial date approached, one thing became undeniably clear. the mask was off. For 30 years, Big Daddy had hidden behind wealth, power, and carefully constructed PR. He'd been celebrated as a mogul, a visionary, a success story. People had looked at his billion-dollar empire and seen achievement rather than exploitation. But underneath the mansions and the private jets and the magazine covers was something rotten, something that had been there from the beginning, growing and metastasizing, fed by power and protected by an industry that valued profit over people. Sean Cole hadn't become a monster overnight. He'd been built slowly by trauma, by poverty, by institutional abuse, by a world that taught him power was the only thing that mattered. And then he'd spent decades perfecting the art of exploitation, building systems to facilitate abuse while the world applauded his success. Marcus Raymond, Big Truth, Jamal Carter, Andre Martinez, Jasmine Cruz. The names of victims kept adding up, each one a life damaged or destroyed by Big Daddy's hunger for control. And behind each name were countless others who'd never come forward, who were still too afraid, who'd taken the settlements and signed the NDAs and tried to move on with their broken lives. The trial would determine Big Daddy's legal fate, guilty or not guilty, prison or freedom. But in a larger sense, the verdict was already in. The empire was destroyed. The legacy was ruined. The man who'd wanted to be remembered as a visionary would instead be remembered as a predator. Not because the system had worked. The system had protected him for decades. Not because justice naturally prevailed. Justice had failed his victims over and over. But because one woman, Jasmine Cruz, had been brave enough to speak. And her courage had given others permission to stop protecting their abuser. The mask was ripped off. And underneath was exactly what everyone had always suspected, but had been too afraid or too complicit to acknowledge. A monster who'd hidden in plain sight. A predator who'd been protected by success. An empire built on bodies. And finally, the world was forced to look. Don't just watch, subscribe. Help Mr. Sammy Stories hit 1,000 subscribers.